Section 1 of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, edited and selected by W.B. Yeats. Introduction. Dr. Corbet, Bishop of Oxford and Norwich, lamented long ago the departure of the English fairies. In Queen Mary's time he wrote, "When Tom came home from labour, or sis to milking rose, then merrily, merrily went their tabor, and merrily went their toes." But now, in the times of James, they had all gone, for they were of the old profession, and their songs were Ave Maries. In Ireland they are still extant, giving gifts to the kindly, and plaguing the surly. "Have you ever seen a fairy or such like?" I asked an old man in County Sligo. "Amn't I annoyed with them?" was the answer. "Do the fishermen along here know anything of the mermaids?" I asked a woman of a village in County Dublin. "Indeed, they don't like to see them at all," she answered, "for they always bring bad weather." "Here is a man who believes in ghosts," said a foreign sea captain, pointing to a pilot of my acquaintance. "In every house over there," said the pilot, pointing to his native village of Rosses, "there are several." Certainly that now old and much respected dogmatist, the spirit of the age, has in no manner made his voice heard down there. In a little while, for he has gotten a consumptive appearance of late, he will be covered over decently in his grave, and another will grow, old and much respected, in his place, and never be heard of down there, and after him another, and another, and another. Indeed, it is a question whether any of these personages will ever be heard of outside the newspaper offices, and lecture rooms, and drawing rooms, and eel pie houses of the cities, or if the spirit of the age is at any time more than a froth. At any rate, whole troops of their like will not change the Celt much. Giraldus Cambyses found the people of the Western Islands a trifle paganish. "How many gods are there?" asked a priest a little while ago of a man from the island of Innistor. "There is one on Innistor, but this seems a big place," said the man, and the priest held up his hands in horror, as Giraldus had done just 7 centuries before. Remember, I am not blaming the man. It is very much better to believe in a number of gods than in none at all, or to think that there is only one, but that he is a little sentimental and impracticable, and not constructed for the 19th century. The Celt, and his cromlechs, and his pillar stones, these will not change much. Indeed, it is doubtful if anybody at all changes at any time. In spite of hosts of deniers, and asserters, and wise men, and professors, the majority still are averse to setting down to dine 13 at table, or being helped to salt, or walking under a ladder, or seeing a single magpie flirting his checkered tail. There are, of course, children of light who have set their faces against all this, though even a newspaper man, if you entice him into a cemetery at midnight, will believe in phantoms, for everyone is a visionary, if you scratch him deep enough, but the Celt is a visionary without scratching. Yet be it noticed, if you are a stranger, you will not readily get ghost and fairy legends, even in a western village. You must go adroitly to work, and make friends with the children and the old men, with those who have not felt the pressure of mere daylight existence, and those with whom it is growing less, and will have altogether taken itself off one of these days. The old women are most learned, but will not so readily be got to talk, for the fairies are very secretive, and much resent being talked of. And are there not many stories of old women who were nearly pinched into their graves, or numbed with fairy blasts? At sea, when the nets are out and the pipes are lit, there will be some ancient hoarder of tales become loquacious, telling his histories to the tune of the creaking of the boats. Holy Eve night, too, is a great time, and in old days many tales were to be heard at wakes, but the priests have set faces against wakes. In the Parochial Survey of Ireland it is recorded how the storytellers used to gather together of an evening, and if any had a different version from the others, they would all recite theirs and vote, and the man who had varied would have to abide by their verdict. In this way stories have been handed down with such accuracy that the long tale of Deirdre was, in the earlier decades of this century, told almost word for word, as in the very ancient manuscripts in the Royal Dublin Society. In one case only it varied, and then the manuscript was obviously wrong. A passage had been forgotten by the copyist. But this accuracy is rather in the folk and bardic tales than in the fairy legends, for these vary widely, being usually adapted to some neighbouring village or local fairy-seeing celebrity. Each county has usually some family or personage supposed to have been favoured or plagued, especially by the phantoms, as the Hacketts of Castle Hacket, Galway, who had for their ancestor a fairy, or John O'Daly of Lissadell, Sligo, who wrote Eileen Irune, the song the Scotch have stolen and called Robin Adair, and which Handel would sooner have written than all his oratorios, and the O'Donoghue of Kerry. Round these men stories tended to group themselves, sometimes deserting more ancient heroes for the purpose. Round poets they have gathered especially, for poetry in Ireland has always been mysteriously connected with magic. These folk tales are full of simplicity and musical occurrences, for they are the literature of a class for whom every incident in the old rut of birth, love, pain, and death has cropped up unchanged for centuries, who have steeped everything in the heart, to whom everything is a symbol. They have the spade over which man has leant from the beginning. The people of the cities have the machine, which is prose, and a parvenu. They have few events. They can turn over the incidents of a long life as they sit by the fire. With us nothing has time to gather meaning, and too many things are occurring for even a big heart to hold. It is said the most eloquent people in the world are the Arabs, who have only the bare earth of the desert and a sky swept bare by the sun. Wisdom has alighted upon 3 things, goes their proverb: the hand of the Chinese, the brain of the Frank, and the tongue of the Arab. This, I take it, is the meaning of that simplicity sought for so much in these days by all the poets, and not to be had at any price. The most notable and typical storyteller of my acquaintance is one Paddy Flynn, a little bright-eyed old man living in a leaky one-roomed cottage of the village of B, the most gentle, i.e. fairy place, in the whole of County Sligo, he says, though others claim that honour for Drumahair or for Drumcliff. A very pious old man, too. You may have some time to inspect his strange figure and ragged hair, if he happen to be in a devout humour, before he comes to the doings of the gentry. A strange devotion. Old tales of Columkill, and what he said to his mother. How are you to-day, mother? Worse. May you be worse to-morrow. And on the next day. How are you to-day, mother? Worse. May you be worse to-morrow. And on the next. How are you to-day, mother? Better, thank God. May you be better to-morrow. In which undutiful manner he will tell you Columkill inculcated cheerfulness. Then most likely he will wander off into his favourite theme, how the judge smiles alike in rewarding the good and condemning the lost to unceasing flames. Very consoling does it appear to Paddy Flynn, this melancholy and apocalyptic cheerfulness of the judge, nor seems his own cheerfulness quite earthly, though a very palpable cheerfulness. The first time I saw him he was cooking mushrooms for himself, and the next time he was asleep under a hedge, smiling in his sleep. Assuredly some joy not quite of this steadfast earth lightens in those eyes, swift as the eyes of a rabbit, among so many wrinkles, for Paddy Flynn is very old. A melancholy there is in the midst of their cheerfulness, a melancholy that is almost a portion of their joy, the visionary melancholy of purely instinctive natures, and of all animals. In the triple solitude of age and eccentricity and partial deafness, he goes about much pestered by children. As to the reality of his fairy and spirit-seeing powers, not all are agreed. One day we were talking of the banshee. I have seen it, he said, down there by the water, batting the river with its hands. He it was who said the fairies annoyed him. Not that the sceptic is entirely afar even from these western villages. I found him one morning as he bound his corn in a merest pocket-handkerchief of a field. Very different from Paddy Flynn, and a travelled man too. Very different from Paddy Flynn, scepticism in every wrinkle of his face, and a travelled man too. A foot-long Mohawk Indian tattooed on one of his arms to evidence the matter. Those who travel, says a neighbouring priest, shaking his head over him, and quoting Thomas à Kempis, seldom come home wholly. I had mentioned ghosts to this sceptic. Ghosts, said he. There are no such things at all, but the gentry, they stand to reason. For the devil, when he fell out of heaven, took the weak-minded ones with him, and they were put into the waste places, and that's what the gentry are. But they are getting scarce now, because their time's over, ye see, and they're going back. But ghosts, no. And I'll tell ye something more I don't believe in, the fire of hell. Then, in a low voice, that's only invented to give the priests and parsons something to do. Thereupon this man, so full of enlightenment, returned to his corn-binding. The various collectors of Irish folklore have, from our point of view, one great merit, and from the point of view of others, one great fault. They have made their work literature rather than science, and told us of the Irish peasantry rather than of the primitive religion of mankind, or whatever else the folklorists are on the gad after. To be considered scientists, they should have tabulated all their tales in forms like grocers' bills. Item the fairy king, item the queen. Instead of this, they have caught the very voice of the people, the very pulse of life, each giving what was most noticed in his day. Croker and Lover, full of the ideas of harum-scarum Irish gentility, saw everything humorized. The impulse of the Irish literature of their time came from a class that did not, mainly for political reasons, take the populace seriously, and imagined the country as a humorist's Arcadia. Its passion, its gloom, its tragedy, they knew nothing of. What they did was not wholly false. They merely magnified an irresponsible type, found oftenest among boatmen, carmen, and gentlemen's servants, into the type of a whole nation, and created the stage Irishman. The writers of '48 and the famine combined burst their bubble. Their work had the dash, as well as the shallowness, of an ascendant and idle class, and in Croker is touched everywhere with beauty, a gentle Arcadian beauty. Carleton, a peasant born, has in many of his stories, I have only been able to give a few of the slightest, more especially in his ghost stories, a much more serious way with him, for all his humour. Kennedy, an old bookseller in Dublin, who seems to have had a something of genuine belief in the fairies, came next in time. He has far less literary faculty, but is wonderfully accurate, giving often the very words the stories were told in. But the best book since Croker is Lady Wilde's Ancient Tales. The humour has all given way to pathos and tenderness. We have here the innermost heart of the Celt, in the moments he has grown to love through years of persecution, when, cushioning himself about with dreams, and hearing fairy songs in the twilight, he ponders on the soul and on the dead. Here is the Celt, only it is the Celt dreaming. Besides these are two writers of importance who have published, so far, nothing in book shape, Miss Letitia McClintock and Mr. Douglas Hyde. Miss McClintock writes accurately and beautifully the half-Scotch dialect of Ulster, and Mr. Douglas Hyde is now preparing a volume of folk tales in Gaelic, having taken them down, for the most part, word for word, among the Gaelic speakers of Roscommon and Galway. He is, perhaps, most to be trusted of all. He knows the people thoroughly. Others see a phase of Irish life. He understands all its elements. His work is neither humorous nor mournful. It is simply life. I hope he may put some of his gatherings into ballads, for he is the last of our ballad writers of the school of Walsh and Callanan, men whose work seems fragrant with turf smoke. And this brings to mind the chap-books. They are to be found, brown with turf smoke, on cottage shelves, and are, or were, sold on every hand by the pedlars, but cannot be found in any library of this city of the Sassenach. The royal fairy tales, the Hibernian tales, and the legends of the fairies are the fairy literature of the people. Several specimens of our fairy poetry are given. It is more like the fairy poetry of Scotland than of England. The personages of English fairy literature are merely, in most cases, mortals beautifully masquerading. Nobody ever believed in such fairies. They are romantic bubbles from Provence. Nobody ever laid new milk on their doorstep for them. As to my own part in this book, I have tried to make it representative, as far as so few pages would allow, of every kind of Irish folk faith. The reader will perhaps wonder that in all my notes I have not rationalized a single hobgoblin. I seek for shelter to the words of Socrates. Phaedrus, I should like to know, Socrates, whether the place is not somewhere here at which Boreas is said to have carried off Orithyia from the banks of the Ilissus. Socrates, that is the tradition. Phaedrus, and is this the exact spot? The little stream is delightfully clear and bright. I can fancy that there might be maidens playing near. Socrates, I believe the spot is not exactly here, but about 1/4 of a mile lower down, where you cross to the temple of Artemis. And I think that there is some sort of altar to Boreas at the place. Phaedrus, I do not recollect, but I beseech you to tell me, Socrates, do you believe this tale? Socrates, the wise are doubtful, and I should not be singular if, like them, I also doubted. I might have a rational explanation that Orithyia was playing with Pharmacia when a northern gust carried her over the neighbouring rocks, and this being the manner of her death, she was said to have been carried away by Boreas. There is a discrepancy, however, about the locality. According to another version of the story, she was taken from the Areopagus, and not from this place. Now I quite acknowledge that these allegories are very nice, but he is not to be envied who has to invent them. Much labour and ingenuity will be required of him, and when he has once begun, he must go on and rehabilitate centaurs and chimeras dire. Gorgons and winged steeds flow in apace, and numberless other inconceivable and portentous monsters. And if he is sceptical about them, and would fain reduce them one after another to the rules of probability, this sort of crude philosophy will take up all his time. Now, I have certainly not time for such inquiries. Shall I tell you why? I must first know myself, as the Delphian inscription says. To be curious about that which is not my business, while I am still in ignorance of my own self, would be ridiculous. And therefore I say farewell to all this. The common opinion is enough for me. For, as I was saying, I want to know not about this, but about myself. Am I, indeed, a wonder more complicated and swollen with passion than the serpent Typho, or a creature of gentler and simpler sort, to whom nature has given a diviner and lowlier destiny? I have to thank Messrs. Macmillan and the editors of Belgravia, All the Year Round, and Monthly Packet, for leave to quote from Patrick Kennedy's Legendary Fictions of the Irish Celts, and Miss McClintock's articles, respectively. Lady Wilde for leave to give what I would from her Ancient Legends of Ireland, Ward and Downey, and Mr. Douglas Hyde for his 3 unpublished stories, and for valuable and valued assistance in several ways, and also Mr. Allingham and other copyright holders for their poems. Mr. Allingham's poems are from Irish Songs and Poems, Reeves and Turner, Ferguson's from Seeley, Bryars and Walker's shilling reprint, my own and Miss O'Leary's from Ballads and Poems of Young Ireland, 1888, a little anthology published by Gill and Sons, Dublin. W. B. Yeats. End of section 1. Section 2 of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry by William Butler Yeats. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Trooping Fairies. The Irish word for fairy is sheog, a diminutive of the she in banshee. Fairies are dinashi, fairy people. Who are they? Fallen angels who were not good enough to be saved, nor bad enough to be lost, say the peasantry. The gods of the earth, says the Book of Armagh. The gods of pagan Ireland, say the Irish antiquitarians. The Tuatha De Danann, who, when no longer worshipped and fed with offerings, dwindled away in the popular imagination, and are now only a few spans high. And they will tell you, in proof, that the names of fairy chiefs are the names of old Danann heroes, and the places where they especially gather together, Danann burying places, and that the Tuatha De Danann used to be called Sloashi, the fairy host, or Marcarshi, the fairy cavalcade. On the other hand, there is much evidence to prove them fallen angels. Witness the nature of the creatures, their caprice, their way of being too good to the good and evil to the evil, having every charm but conscience, consistency. Beings so quickly offended that you must not speak much about them at all, and never call them anything but the gentry, or else Dinna Maha, which in English means good people, yet so easily pleased they will do their best to keep misfortune away from you, if you leave a little milk for them on the window-sill overnight. On the whole, the popular belief tells us most about them, telling us how they fell, and yet were not lost, because their evil was wholly without malice. Are they the gods of the earth? Perhaps. Many poets and all mystic and occult writers, in all ages and countries, have declared that behind the visible are chains on chains of conscious beings, who are not of heaven but of the earth, who have no inherent form, but change according to their whim, or the mind that sees them. You cannot lift your hand without influencing and being influenced by hordes. The visible world is merely their skin. In dreams we go amongst them, and play with them, and combat with them. They are, perhaps, human souls in the crucible, these creatures of whim. Do not think the fairies are always little. Everything is capricious about them, even their size. They seem to take what size or shape pleases them. Their chief occupations are feasting, fighting, and making love, and playing the most beautiful music. They have only one industrious person among them, the leprechaun, the shoemaker. Perhaps they wear their shoes out with dancing. Near the village of Ballisdare is a little woman who lived among them 7 years. When she came home she had no toes. She had danced them off. They have 3 great festivals in the year: May Eve, Midsummer Eve, November Eve. On May Eve, every 7th year, they fight all round, but mostly on the plain of Bon, wherever that is, for the harvest. For the best ears of grain belong to them. An old man told me he saw them fight once. They tore the thatch off a house in the midst of it all. Had anyone else been near, they would merely have seen a great gust of wind whirling everything into the air as it passed. When the wind makes the straws and leaves whirl as it passes, that is the fairies, and the peasantry take off their hats and say God bless them. On Midsummer Eve, when the bonfires are lighted on every hill in honour of St. John, the fairies are at their gayest, and sometimes steal away beautiful mortals to be their brides. On November Eve they are at their gloomiest, for according to the old Gaelic reckoning this is the first night of winter. This night they dance with the ghosts, and the pooka is abroad, and witches make their spells, and girls set a table with food in the name of the devil, that the fetch of their future lover may come through the window and eat of the food. After November Eve the blackberries are no longer wholesome, for the pooka has spoiled them. When they are angry they paralyse men and cattle with their fairy darts. When they are gay they sing. Many a poor girl has heard them, and pined away and died, for love of that singing. Plenty of the old beautiful tunes of Ireland are their only music, caught up by eavesdroppers. No wise peasant would hum the pretty girl milking the cow near a fairy rath, for they are jealous, and do not like to hear their songs on clumsy mortal lips. Carolan, the last of the Irish bards, slept on a rath, and ever after the fairy tunes ran in his head, and made him the great man he was. Do they die? Blake saw a fairy's funeral, but in Ireland we say they are immortal. The Fairies, William Allingham. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting, for fear of little men. Wee folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and white owl's feather. Down along the rocky shore some make their home, they live on crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam. Some in the reeds of the black mountain lake, with frogs for their watch-dogs, all night awake. High on the hill-top the old king sits, he is now so old and grey, he's nigh lost his wits. With a bridge of white mist Columkill he crosses, on his stately journeys from Slieve-League to Rosses, or going up with music on cold starry nights, to sup with the queen of the gay northern lights. They stole little Bridget for 7 years long. When she came down again her friends were all gone. They took her lightly back, between the night and morrow. They thought that she was fast asleep, but she was dead with sorrow. They have kept her ever since, deep within the lake, on a bed of flag-leaves, watching till she wake. By the craggy hillside, through the mosses bare, they have planted thorn-trees for pleasure here and there. Is any man so daring as dig them up in spite, he shall find their sharpest thorns in his bed at night. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting, for fear of little men. Wee folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and white owl's feather. End section 2. Section 3 of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Frank Martin and the Fairies, William Carleton. Martin was a thin, pale man, when I saw him, of a sickly look and a constitution naturally feeble. His hair was a light auburn, his beard mostly unshaven, and his hands of a singular delicacy and whiteness, owing, I dare say, as much to the soft and easy nature of his employment as to his infirm health. In everything else he was as sensible, sober, and rational as any other man. But on the topic of fairies, the man's mania was peculiarly strong and immovable. Indeed, I remember the expression of his eyes was singularly wild and hollow, and his long narrow temples sallow and emaciated. Now, this man did not lead an unhappy life, nor did the malady he laboured under seem to be productive of either pain or terror to him, although one might be apt to imagine otherwise. On the contrary, he and the fairies maintained the most friendly intimacy, and their dialogues, which I fear were woefully one-sided ones, must have been a source of great pleasure to him, for they were conducted with much mirth and laughter, on his part at least. "Well, Frank, when did you see the fairies?" "Whist! There's 24 of 'em in the shop, the weaving shop, this minute. There's a little old fellow sitting at the top of the slies, all to be rocked while I'm weaving. The sorrow's in them, but they're the greatest little scamers alive, so they are. See, there's another of them at my dressing noggin. Get out of that, you shingawn, or bad cess to me if you don't, but I'll lave you a mark. Ha! Cut, you thief, you!" "Frank, aren't you afeard of them?" "Is it me? Arrah, what I to be afeard of them for? Sure they have no power over me." "And why haven't they, Frank?" "Because I was baptized against them." "What do you mean by that?" "Why, the priest that christened me was told by my father to put in the proper prayer against the fairies, and a priest can't refuse it when he's asked, and he did so. Begorra, it's well for me that he did. Let the tallow alone, you little glutton. See, there's a weeny thief of them atin' my tallow." "Because, you see, it was their intention to make me king of the fairies." "Is it possible?" "Devil a lie in it. Sure you may ax them, and they'll tell you." "What size are they, Frank?" "Oh, wee little fellows, with green coats, and the purtiest little shoes ever you seen. There's 2 of them, both old acquaintances o' mine, running along the yarn beam. That old fellow with the bob wig is called Jim Jam, and the other chap with the 3-cocked hat is called Nicky Nick. Nicky plays the pipes. Nicky, give us a tune, or I'll malivogue you. Come now. Luern shore. Whist now, listen." The poor fellow, though weaving as fast as he could all the time, yet bestowed every possible mark of attention to the music, and seemed to enjoy it as much as if it had been real. But who can tell whether that which we look upon as a privation may not after all have been a fountain of increased happiness, greater perhaps than any which we ourselves enjoy? I forget who the poet is who says, "Mysterious are they laws, the vision's finer than the view. Her landscape nature never drew, so fair as fancy draws." Many a time, when a mere child, not more than 6 or 7 years of age, have I gone as far as Frank's weaving shop, in order, with a heart divided between curiosity and fear, to listen to his conversation with the good people. From morning till night his tongue was going almost as incessantly as his shuttle, and it was well known that at night, whenever he awoke out of his sleep, the first thing he did was put out his hand and push them, as it were, off his bed. "Go out of this, you thieves, you! Go out of this now, and let me alone. Nicky, is this any time to be playing the pipes, and me wants to sleep? Go off now. Troth, if yez do, you'll see what I'll give yez to-morrow. Sure, I'll be making new dressin's, and if yez behave decently, maybe I'll lave ye the scrapin's of the pot. There now, och, poor things, they're dacent cratures. Sure they're gone, barrin' poor Redcap, that doesn't like to lave me." And then the harmless monomaniac would fall back into what we trust was an innocent slumber. About this time there was said to have occurred a very remarkable circumstance, which gave poor Frank a vast deal of importance among the neighbours. A man named Frank Thomas, the same in whose house Mickey McRory held the first dance at which I ever saw him, as detailed in a former sketch. This man, I say, had a child sick, but of what complaint I cannot now remember, nor is it of any importance. One of the gables of Thomas's house was built against, or rather into, a forth or rath called Towny, or perhaps Tonic Forth. It was said to be haunted by the fairies, and what gave it a character peculiarly wild in my eyes was, that there were on the southern side of it 2 or 3 little green mounds, which were said to be the graves of unchristened children, over which it was considered dangerous and unlucky to pass. At all events, the season was midsummer, and one evening, about dusk, during the illness of the child, the noise of a handsaw was heard upon the Forth. This was considered rather strange, and, after a little time, a few of those who were assembled at Frank Thomas's went to see who it could be that was sawing in such a place, or what they could be sawing at so late an hour, for every one knew that nobody in the whole country about them would dare to cut down the few whitethorns that grew upon the Forth. On going to examine, however, judge of their surprise when, after surrounding and searching the whole place, they could discover no trace of either saw or sawyer. In fact, with the exception of themselves, there was no one, either natural or supernatural, visible. Then they returned to the house, and had scarcely sat down, when it was heard again within 10 yards of them. Another examination of the premises took place, but with equal success. Now, however, while standing at the Forth, they heard the sawing in a little hollow, about 150 yards below them, which was completely exposed to their view, but they could see nobody. A party of them immediately went down to ascertain, if possible, what this singular noise and invisible labour could mean, but on arriving at the spot they heard the sawing, to which were now added hammering, and the driving of nails upon the Forth above, while those who stood on the Forth continued to hear it in the hollow. On comparing notes, they resolved to send down to Billy Nelson's for Frank Martin, a distance of only about 80 or 90 yards. He was soon on the spot, and without a moment's hesitation solved the enigma. "'Tis the fairies," said he. "I see them, and busy crathurs they are." "But what are they sawing, Frank?" "They are making a child's coffin," he replied. "They have the body already made, and now they're nailing the lid together." That night the child died, and the story goes that on the second evening afterwards, the carpenter who was called upon to make the coffin brought a table out from Thomas's house to the Forth as a temporary bench, and it is said that the sawing and hammering necessary for the completion of his task were precisely the same which had been heard the evening but one before, neither more nor less. I remember the death of the child myself, and the making of its coffin, but I think the story of the supernatural carpenter was not heard in the village for some months after its interment. Frank had every appearance of a hypochondriac about him. At the time I saw him he might be about 34 years of age, but I do not think, from the debility of his frame and infirm health, that he has been alive for several years. He was an object of considerable interest and curiosity, and often have I been present when he was pointed out to strangers as the man that could see the good people. Section 3. Section 4 of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry by William Butler Yeats. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Priest's Supper, T. Crofton Croker. It is said by those who ought to understand such things, that the good people, or the fairies, are some of the angels who were turned out of heaven, and who landed on their feet in this world, while the rest of their companions, who had more sin to sink them, went down farther to a worse place. Be this as it may, there was a merry troop of the fairies, dancing and playing all manner of wild pranks, on a bright moonlight evening towards the end of September. The scene of their merriment was not far distant from Inchgeela in the west of the county Cork, a poor village, although it had a barrack for soldiers, but great mountains and barren rocks, like those round about it, are enough to strike poverty into any place. However, as the fairies can have everything they want for wishing, poverty does not trouble them much, and all their care is to seek out unfrequented nooks and places where it is not likely any one will come to spoil their sport. On a nice green sod by the river's side were the little fellows dancing in a ring as gaily as may be, with their red caps wagging about at every bound in the moonshine, and so light were these bounds that the lobs of dew, although they trembled under their feet, were not disturbed by their capering. Thus did they carry on their gambols, spinning round and round, and twirling and bobbing and diving, and going through all manner of figures, until one of them chirped out, "Cease, cease with your drumming, here's an end to our mumming, by my smell I can tell a priest this way is coming." And away every one of the fairies scampered off as hard as they could, concealing themselves under the green leaves of the Lismore, where, if their little red caps should happen to peep out, they would only look like its crimson bells, and more hid themselves at the shady side of stones and brambles, and others under the bank of the river, and in holes and crannies of one kind or another. The fairy speaker was not mistaken, for along the road, which was within view of the river, came Father Horrigan on his pony, thinking to himself that as it was so late he would make an end of his journey at the first cabin he came to. According to this determination, he stopped at the dwelling of Dermod Leary, lifted the latch, and entered with, "My blessing on all here." I need not say that Father Horrigan was a welcome guest wherever he went, for no man was more pious or better beloved in the country. Now it was a great trouble to Dermod that he had nothing to offer his reverence for supper, as a relish to the potatoes which the old woman, for so Dermod called his wife, though she was not much past 20, had down to boiling in a pot over the fire. He thought of the net which he had set in the river, but as it had been there only a short time, the chances were against his finding a fish in it. No matter, thought Dermod, there can be no harm in stepping down to try, and maybe, as I want the fish for the priest's supper, that one will be there before me. Down to the riverside went Dermod, and he found in the net as fine a salmon as ever jumped in the bright waters of the spreading Lee. But as he was going to take it out, the net was pulled from him, he could not tell how or by whom, and away got the salmon, and went swimming along with the current as gaily as if nothing had happened. Dermod looked sorrowfully at the wake which the fish had left upon the water, shining like a line of silver in the moonlight, and then, with an angry motion of his right hand, and a stamp of his foot, gave vent to his feelings by muttering, "May bitter bad luck attend you night and day, for a blackguard schemer of a salmon wherever you go. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, if there's any shame in you, to give me the slip after this fashion, and I'm clear in my own mind you'll come to no good, for some kind of evil thing or other helped you. Did I not feel it pull the net against me as strong as the devil himself?" "That's not true for you," said one of the little fairies, who had scampered off at the approach of the priest, coming up to Dermod Leary with a whole throng of companions at his heels. "There was only 12 of us pulling against you." Dermod gazed at the tiny speaker with wonder, who continued, "Make yourself no ways uneasy about the priest's supper, for if you will go back and ask him one question from us, there will be as fine a supper as was ever put upon a table spread out before him in less than no time." "I'll have nothing at all to do with you," replied Dermod in a tone of determination, and after a pause he added, "I'm much obliged to you for your offer, sir, but I know better than to sell myself to you, or the like of you, for a supper. And more than that, I know Father Horrigan has more regard for my soul than to wish me pledge it for ever, out of regard to anything you could put before him. So there's an end of the matter." The little speaker, with a pertinacity not to be repulsed by Dermod's manner, continued, "Will you ask the priest one civil question for us?" Dermod considered for some time, and he was right in doing so, but he thought that no one could come to harm out of asking a civil question. "I see no objection to do that same, gentlemen," said Dermod, "but I will have nothing in life to do with your supper, mind that." "Then," said the little speaking fairy, whilst the rest came crowding after him from all parts, "go and ask Father Horrigan to tell us whether our souls will be saved at the last day, like the souls of good Christians, and if you wish us well, bring back word what he says without delay." Away went Dermod to his cabin, where he found the potatoes thrown out on the table, and his good woman handing the biggest of them all, a beautiful laughing red apple, smoking like a hard-ridden horse on a frosty night, over to Father Horrigan. "Please your reverence," said Dermod, after some hesitation, "may I make bold to ask your honour one question?" "What may that be?" said Father Horrigan. "Why then, begging your reverence's pardon for my freedom, it is, if the souls of the good people are to be saved at the last day." "Who bid you ask me that question, Leary?" said the priest, fixing his eyes upon him very sternly, which Dermod could not stand before at all. "I'll tell no lies about the matter, and nothing in life but the truth," said Dermod. "It was the good people themselves who sent me to ask the question, and there they are in thousands down on the bank of the river waiting for me to go back with the answer." "Go back by all means," said the priest, "and tell them, if they want to know,
to come here to me themselves, and I'll answer that or any other question they are pleased to ask, with the greatest pleasure in life." Diarmid accordingly returned to the fairies, who came swarming about him to hear what the priest had said in reply, and Diarmid spoke out among them like a bold man as he was. But when they heard that they must go to the priest, away they fled, some here and more there, and some this way and more that, whisking by poor Diarmid so fast and in such numbers that he was quite bewildered. When he came to himself, which was not for a long time, back he went to his cabin, and ate his dry potatoes along with Father Horrigan, who made quite light of the thing. But Diarmid could not help thinking it a mighty hard case that his reverence, whose words had the power to banish the fairies at such a rate, should have no sort of relish to his supper, and that the fine salmon he had in his net should have been got away from him in such a manner. The Fairy Well of Lag na Nay, by Samuel Fergusson. Mournfully, sing mournfully, oh listen, Ellen, sister dear, is there no help at all for me, but only ceaseless sigh and tear? Why did not he who left me here with stolen hope steal memory? Oh listen, Ellen, sister dear. Mournfully, sing mournfully, I'll go away to Sleamish Hill, I'll pluck the fairy hawthorn tree, and let the spirits work their will, I care not if for good or ill. So they but lay the memory which all my heart is haunting still. Mournfully, sing mournfully, the fairies are a silent race, and pale as lily flowers to see. I care not for a blanched face, for wandering in a dreaming place, so I but banish memory, I wish I were with Anna Grace. Mournfully, sing mournfully. Hearken to my tale of woe, 'twas thus to weeping Ellen Con, her sisters said in accents low, her only sister Una Bon. 'Twas in their bed before the dawn, and Ellen answered sad and slow, O Una, Una, be not drawn, hearken to my tale of woe. To this unholy grief I pray, which makes me sick at heart to know, and I will help you if I may. The Fairy Well of Lag na Nay. Lie nearer me, I tremble so. Una, I've heard wise women say, hearken to my tale of woe, that if before the dews arise, true maiden in its icy flow, with pure hand bathe her bosom thrice, 3 lady brackens pluck likewise, and 3 times round the fountain go, she straight forgets her tears and sighs. Hearken to my tale of woe. All alas and well away, O sister Ellen, sister sweet, come with me to the hill I pray, and I will prove that blessed freet. They rose with soft and silent feet, they left their mother where she lay, their mother and her care discreet, all alas and well away. And soon they reached the Fairy Well, the mountain's eye, clear cold and grey, wide open in the dreary fell. How long they stood 'twere vain to tell. At last upon the point of day, Bon Una bears her bosom's swell, all alas and well away. Thrice o'er her shrinking breast she laves the gliding glance that will not stay, of subtly steaming fairy waves, and now the charm 3 brackens craves, she plucks them in their fringed array, now round the well her fate she braves, all alas and well away. Save us all from fairy thrall, Ellen sees her face the rim, twice and thrice, and that is all, fount and hill and maiden swim, all together melting dim. Una, Una, thou mayest call, sister sad, but lith or limb, save us all from fairy thrall. Never again of Una Bon, where now she walks in dreamy hall, shall eye of mortal look upon. O can it be the guard was gone, the better guard than shield or wall, who knows on earth save your Loch Don? Save us all from fairy thrall. Behold the banks are green and bare, no pit is here wherein to fall. Ay, at the fount you may well stare, but naught save pebbles smooth is there, and small straws twirling one and all. Hie thee home, and be thy prayer, save us all from fairy thrall. End of section 3. Section 4 of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry by William Butler Yeats. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Teig O'Kane and the Corpse. Literally translated from the Irish by Douglas Hyde.
I found it hard to place Mr. Douglas Hyde's magnificent story among the ghosts or the fairies. It is among the fairies on the grounds that all these ghosts and bodies were in no manner ghosts and bodies, but pishogues, fairy spells. One often hears of these visions in Ireland. I have met a man who had lived a wild life like the man in the story, till a vision came to him in county, one dark night. In no way so terrible a vision as this, but sufficient to change his whole character. He will not go out at night. If you speak to him suddenly, he trembles. He is grown timid and strange. He went to the bishop and was sprinkled with holy water. It may have come as a warning, said the bishop, yet great theologians are of the opinion that no man ever saw an apparition, for no man would survive it. Editor. There was once a grown-up lad in the county Leitrim, and he was strong and lively, and the son of a rich farmer. His father had plenty of money, and he did not spare it on the son. Accordingly, when the boy grew up, he liked sport better than work, and, as his father had no other children, he loved this one so much that he allowed him to do in everything just as it pleased himself. He was very extravagant, and he used to scatter the gold money as another person would scatter the white. He was seldom to be found at home, but if there was a fair, or a race, or a gathering within 10 miles of him, you were dead certain to find him there. And he seldom spent a night in his father's house, but he used to be always out rambling, and like Sean Bui long ago, there was Grath gach Kailin Imrola Kalinya, the love of every girl in the breast of his shirt, and it's many's the kiss he got and he gave, for he was very handsome. And there wasn't a girl in the country but would fall in love with him, only for him to fasten his 2 eyes on her, and it was for that someone made this ran on him. Fioch and roger gadirach poiga. Ni hinket smora I veta marata. Ag lement agahowida, da arnan na gringoig, anusas anois naha, no kodlacht sadla. A levant aganhuida, da arnan na grigwa. Na granyag, anus anois, na kodlacht sadla. Look at the rogue, for its kisses he's rambling. It isn't much wonder, for that was his way. He's like an old hedgehog, at night he'll be scrambling from this place to that, but he'll sleep in the day. At last he became very wild and unruly. He wasn't to be seen day nor night in his father's house, but always rambling or going on his ceilidh from place to place and from house to house, so that the old people used to shake their heads and say to one another, "It's easy seen what will happen to the land when the old man dies. His son will run through it in a year, and it won't stand him that long itself." He used to be always gambling and card-playing and drinking, but his father never minded his bad habits, and never punished him. But it happened one day that the old man was told that the son had ruined the character of a girl in the neighbourhood, and he was greatly angry, and he called the son to him and said to him, quietly and sensibly, "Avik," says he, "you know I loved you greatly up to this, and I never stopped you from doing your choice thing, whatever it was, and I kept plenty of money with you, and I always hoped to leave you the house and the land, and all I had after myself would be gone. But I heard a story of you today that has disgusted me with you. I cannot tell you the grief that I felt when I heard such a thing of you, and I tell you now plainly that unless you marry that girl, I'll leave house and land and everything to my brother's son. I never could leave it to anyone who would make so bad a use of it as you do yourself, deceiving women and coaxing girls. Settle with yourself now whether you'll marry that girl and get my land as a fortune with her, or refuse to marry her and give up all that was coming to you, and tell me in the morning which of the 2 things you have chosen." "Och, Dumnu Shiri, father, you wouldn't say that to me, and I such a good son as I am. Who told you I wouldn't marry the girl?" says he. But his father was gone, and the lad knew well enough he would keep his word too, and he was greatly troubled in his mind, for as quiet and kind as the father was, he never went back of a word that he had once said, and there wasn't another man in the country who was harder to bend than he was. The boy did not know rightly what to do. He was in love with the girl indeed, and he hoped to marry her some time or other, but he would much sooner have remained another while as he was, and followed his old tricks, drinking, sporting, and playing cards, and along with that he was angry that his father should order him to marry, and should threaten him if he did not do it.
"Isn't my father a great fool?" says he to himself. "I was ready enough, and only too anxious to marry Mary, and now since he has threatened me, faith I've a great mind to let it go another while." His mind was so much excited that he remained between two notions as to what he should do. He walked out into the night at last to cool his heated blood, and went on to the road. He lit a pipe, and as the night was fine he walked and walked on until the quick pace made him begin to forget his trouble. The night was bright and the moon half full. There was not a breath of wind blowing, and the air was calm and mild. He walked on for nearly 3 hours, when he suddenly remembered that it was late in the night, and time for him to turn. "Musha, I think I forgot myself," says he. "It must be near 12 o'clock now." The word was hardly out of his mouth when he heard the sound of many voices, and the trampling of feet on the road before him. "I don't know who can be out so late at night as this, and on such a lonely road," said he to himself. He stood listening, and he heard the voices of many people talking through other, but he could not understand what they were saying. "Oh, wirra," says he, "I'm afraid it's not Irish or English they have. It can't be they're Frenchmen." He went on a couple of yards further, and he saw well enough by the light of the moon a band of little people coming towards him, and they were carrying something big and heavy with them. "Oh, murder," says he to himself, "sure it can't be that they're the good people that's in it." Every rib of hair that was on his head stood up, and there fell a shaking on his bones, for he saw they were coming to him fast. He looked at them again, and perceived there were about 20 little men in it, and there was not a man at all of them higher than about 3 feet or 3 feet and a half, and some of them were grey, and seemed very old. He looked again, but he could not make out what was the heavy thing they were carrying until they came up to him, and then they all stood round about him. They threw the heavy thing down on the road, and he saw on the spot that it was a dead body. He became as cold as death, and there was not a drop of blood running in his veins when an old grey maneen came up to him and said, "Isn't it lucky we met you, Teig O'Kane?" Poor Teig could not bring out a word at all, nor open his lips, if he were to get the world for it, and so he gave no answer. "Teig O'Kane," said the little grey man again, "isn't it timely you met us?" Teig could not answer him. "Teig O'Kane," says he, the third time, "isn't it lucky and timely that we met you?" But Teig remained silent, for he was afraid to return an answer, and his tongue was as if it was tied to the roof of his mouth. The little grey man turned to his companions, and there was joy in his bright little eye. "And now," says he, "Teig O'Kane hasn't a word. We can do with him what we please. Teig, Teig," says he, "you're living a bad life, and we can make a slave of you now, and you cannot withstand us. There's no use in trying to go against us. Lift that corpse." Teig was so frightened he was only able to utter the 2 words, "I won't," for as frightened as he was obstinate and stiff, the same as ever. "Teig O'Kane won't lift the corpse," said the little maneen, with a wicked little laugh, for all the world like the breaking of a lock of dry kippeens, and with a little harsh voice like the striking of a cracked bell. "Teig O'Kane won't lift the corpse. Make him lift it." And before the word was out of his mouth, they had all gathered round poor Teig, and they all talking and laughing through other. Teig tried to run from them, but they followed him, and a man of them stretched out his foot before him as he ran, so that Teig was thrown in a heap on the road. Then before he could rise up the fairies caught him, some by the hands and some by the feet, and they held him tight, in a way that he could not stir, with his face against the ground. 6 or 7 of them raised the body and pulled it over to him, and left it down on his back. The breast of the corpse was squeezed against Teig's back and shoulders, and the arms of the corpse were thrown round Teig's neck. Then they stood back from him a couple of yards, and let him get up. He rose, foaming at the mouth and cursing, and he shook himself, thinking to throw the corpse off his back. But his fear and his wonder were great when he found that the 2 arms had a tight hold round his own neck, and that the 2 legs were squeezing his hips firmly, and that, however strongly he tried, he could not throw it off, any more than a horse can throw off its saddle. He was terribly frightened then, and he thought he was lost. "Ochone, for ever," he said to himself. "It's a bad life I'm leading that has given the good people this power over me. I promised to God and Mary, Peter and Paul, Patrick and Bridget, that I'll mend my ways for as long as I have to live, if I come clear out of this danger, and I'll marry the girl." The little grey man came up to him again, and he said to him, "Now, Teigeen," says he, You didn't lift the body when I told you to lift it, and see how you were made to lift it. Perhaps when I tell you to bury it, you won't bury it until you're made to bury it." "Anything at all I can do for your honour," said Teig, "I'll do it," for he was getting sense already, and if it had not been for the great fear that was on him, he never would have let that civil word slip out of his mouth. The little man laughed a sort of laugh again. "You're getting quiet now, Teig," says he. "I'll go bail, but you'll be quiet enough before I'm done with you. Listen to me now, Teig O'Kane, and if you don't obey me in all I'm telling you to do, you'll repent it. You must carry with you this corpse that is on your back to Temple Damus, and you must bring it into the church with you, and make a grave for it in the very middle of the church, and you must raise up the flags and put them down again the very same way, and you must carry the clay out of the church and leave the place as it was when you came, so that no one could know that there had been anything changed. But that's not all. Maybe that the body won't be allowed to be buried in that church. Perhaps some other man has the bed, and if so, it's likely he won't share it with this one. If you don't get leave to bury it on Temple Damus, you must carry it to Carrick Vad Vicoris and bury it in the churchyard there, and if you don't get into that place, take it with you to Temple Ronan, and if that churchyard is closed on you, take it to Imlog Fada, and if you're not able to bury it there, you've no more to do than take it to Kilbreda, and you can bury it there without hindrance. I cannot tell you what one of those churches is the one where you will have leave to bury that corpse under the clay, but I know that it will be allowed you to bury him at some church or other of them. If you do this work rightly, we will be thankful to you, and you will have no cause to grieve. But if you are slow or lazy, believe me, we shall take satisfaction of you." When the little grey man had done speaking, his comrades laughed and clapped their hands together. "Glek, glek, hui, hui," they cried. Go on, go on. You have 8 hours before you till daybreak, and if you haven't this man buried before the sun rises, you're lost." They struck a fist and a foot behind on him, and drove him on in the road. He was obliged to walk, and to walk fast, for they gave him no rest. He thought himself that there was not a wet path, or a dirty boreen, or a crooked contrary road in the whole county that he had not walked that night. The night was at times very dark, and wherever there would come a cloud across the moon he could see nothing, and then he used often to fall. Sometimes he was hurt, and sometimes he escaped, but he was obliged always to rise on the moment and hurry on. Sometimes the moon would break out clearly, and then he would look behind him and see the little people following at his back, and he heard them speaking amongst themselves, talking and crying out, and screaming like a flock of seagulls. And if he was to save his soul, he never understood as much as one word of what they were saying. He did not know how far he had walked, when at last one of them cried out to him, "Stop here." He stood, and they all gathered round him. "Do you see those withered trees over there?" says the old boy to him again. "Temple Damus is among those trees, and you must go in there by yourself, for we cannot follow you or go with you. We must remain here. Go on boldly." Teig looked from him, and he saw a high wall that was in places half broken down, and an old grey church on the inside of the wall, and about a dozen withered old trees scattered here and there round it. There was neither leaf nor twig on any of them, but their bare crooked branches were stretched out like the arms of an angry man when he threatens. He had no help for it, but was obliged to go forward. He was a couple of 100 yards from the church, but he walked on, and never looked behind him until he came to the gate of the churchyard. The old gate was thrown down, and he had no difficulty in entering. He turned to see if any of the little people were following him, but there came a cloud over the moon, and the night became so dark that he could see nothing. He went into the churchyard, and he walked up the grassy pathway leading to the church. When he reached the door, he found it locked. The door was large and strong, and he did not know what to do. At last he drew out his knife with difficulty, and stuck it in the wood to try if it were not rotten, but it was not. "Now," said he to himself, "I have no more to do. The door is shut, and I can't open it." Before the words were rightly shaped in his own mind, a voice in his ear said to him, "Search for the key on top of the door, or on the wall." He started. "Who is that speaking to me?" he cried, turning round, but he saw no one. The voice said in his ear again, "Search for the key on top of the door, or on the wall." "What's that?" said he, and the sweat running from his forehead. "Who spoke to me?" "It's I, the corpse, that spoke to you," said the voice. "Can you talk?" said Teig. "Now and again," said the corpse. Teig searched for the key, and he found it on top of the wall. He was too much frightened to say any more, but he opened the door wide, and as quickly as he could, and he went in, with the corpse on his back. It was as dark as pitch inside, and poor Teig began to shake and tremble. "Light the candle," said the corpse. Teig put his hand in his pocket, as well as he was able, and drew out a flint and steel. He struck a spark out of it, and lit a burnt rag he had in his pocket. He blew it until it made a flame, and he looked round him. The church was very ancient, and part of the wall was broken down. The windows were blown in or cracked, and the timber of the seats was rotten. There were 6 or 7 old iron candlesticks left still there, and in one of these candlesticks Teig found the stump of an old candle, and he lit it. He was still looking round him on the strange and horrid place in which he found himself, when the cold corpse whispered in his ear, "Bury me now, bury me now. There is a spade, and turn the ground." Teig looked from him, and he saw a spade lying beside the altar. He took it up, and he placed the blade under a flag that was in the middle of the aisle, and leaning all his weight on the handle of the spade, he raised it. When the first flag was raised, it was not hard to raise the others near it, and he moved 3 or 4 of them out of their places. The clay that was under them was soft and easy to dig, but he had not thrown up more than 3 or 4 shovelfuls when he felt the iron touch something soft like flesh. He threw up 3 or 4 more shovelfuls from around it, and then he saw it was another body that was buried in the same place. "I'm afraid I'll never be allowed to bury the 2 bodies in the same hole," said Teig in his own mind. "You corpse, there on my back," says he, "will you be satisfied if I bury you down here?" But the corpse never answered him a word. "That's a good sign," said Teig to himself. "Maybe he's getting quiet." And he thrust the spade down in the earth again. Perhaps he hurt the flesh of the other body, for the dead man that was buried there stood up in the grave and shouted an awful shout, "Ho, ho, ho! Go, go, go! Or you're a dead, dead, dead man!" And he fell back in the grave again. Teig said afterwards that of all the wonderful things he saw that night, that was the most awful to him. His hair stood upright on his head like the bristles of a pig, the cold sweat ran off his face, and then came a tremor over all his bones, until he thought he must fall. But after a while he became bolder, when he saw that the second corpse remained lying quietly there, and he threw in the clay on it again, and he smoothed it overhead, and he laid down the flags carefully as they had been before. "It can't be that he'll raise up any more," said he. He went down the aisle a little further, and drew near to the door, and began raising the flags again, looking for another bed for the corpse on his back. He took up 3 or 4 flags and put them aside, and then he dug the clay. He was not long digging until he laid bare an old woman without a thread upon her but her shirt. She was more lively than the first corpse, for he had scarcely taken any of the clay away from about her when she sat up and began to cry, "Ho, you bodach! Ha, you bodach! Where has he been that he got no bed?" Poor Teig drew back, and when she found she was getting no answer, she closed her eyes gently, lost her vigour, and fell back quietly and slowly under the clay. Teig did to her as he had done to the man. He threw the clay back on her, and left the flags down overhead. He began digging again near the door, but before he had thrown up more than a couple of shovelfuls, he noticed a man's hand laid bare by the spade. "By my soul, I'll go no further then," said he to himself. "What use is it for me?" And he threw the clay in again on it, and settled the flags as they had been before. He left the church then, and his heart was heavy enough. But he shut the door and locked it, and left the key where he found it. He sat down on a tombstone that was near the door, and began thinking. He was in great doubt what he should do. He laid his face between his 2 hands, and cried for grief and fatigue, since he was dead certain at this time that he never would come home alive. He made another attempt to loosen the hands of the corpse that were squeezed round his neck, but they were as tight as if they were clamped, and the more he tried to loosen them, the tighter they squeezed him. He was going to sit down once more, when the cold horrid lips of the dead man said to him, "Carrick fod vicoris," and he remembered the command of the good people to bring the corpse with him to that place, if he should be unable to bury it where he had been. He rose up and looked about him. "I don't know the way," he said. As soon as he had uttered the word, the corpse stretched out its left hand that had been tightened round his neck, and kept it pointing out, showing him the road he ought to follow. Teig went in the direction that the fingers were stretched, and passed out of the churchyard. He found himself on an old rutty stone road, and he stood still again, not knowing where to turn. The corpse stretched out its bony hand a second time, and pointed out to him another road, not the road by which he had come when approaching the old church. Teig followed that road, and wherever he came to a path or road meeting it, the corpse always stretched out its hand and pointed with its fingers, showing him the way he was to take. Many was the crossroad he turned down, and many was the crooked boreen he walked, until he saw from him an old burying ground at last, beside the road, but there was neither church nor chapel nor any other building in it. The corpse squeezed him tightly, and he stood. Bury me in the burying ground," said the voice. Teig drew over towards the old burying place, and he was not more than about 20 yards from it when, raising his eyes, he saw hundreds and hundreds of ghosts, men, women, and children, sitting on top of the wall round about, or standing on the inside of it, or running backwards and forwards and pointing at him, while he could see their mouths opening and shutting as if they were speaking, though he heard no word nor any sound amongst them at all. He was afraid to go forward, so he stood where he was, and the moment he stood, all the ghosts became quiet and ceased moving. Then Teig understood that it was trying to keep him from going in that they were. He walked a couple of yards forward, and immediately the whole crowd rushed together toward the spot to which he was moving, and they stood so thickly together that it seemed to him he could never break through them, even though he had a mind to try. But he had no mind to try it. He went back broken and dispirited, and when he had gone a couple of 100 yards from the burying ground, he stood again, for he did not know what way he was to go. He heard the voice of the corpse in his ear saying, "Temple Ronan," and the skinny hand was stretched out again, pointing him out the road. As tired as he was, he had to walk, and the road was neither short nor even. The night was darker than ever, and it was difficult to make his way. Many was the toss he got, and many a bruise they left on his body. At last he saw Temple Ronan from him in the distance, standing in the middle of the burying ground. He moved over towards it, and thought he was all right and safe, when he saw no ghosts nor anything else on the wall, and he thought he would never be hindered now from leaving his load off him at last. He moved over to the gate, but as he was passing in, he tripped on the threshold. Before he could recover himself, something he could not see seized him by the neck, by the hands, and by the feet, and bruised him and shook him and choked him until he was nearly dead, and at last he was lifted up and carried more than 100 yards from that place, and then thrown down in an old dyke, with the corpse still clinging to him. He rose up, bruised and sore, but feared to go near the place again, for he had seen nothing the time he was thrown down and carried away. "You, corpse up on my back," said he, "shall I go over again to the churchyard?" But the corpse never answered him. "That's a sign you don't wish me to try it again," said Teig. He was now in great doubt as to what he ought to do, when the corpse spoke in his ear and said, "Imlog fada." "Oh, murder," said Teig, "must I bring you there? If you keep me long walking like this, I tell you I'll fall under you." He went on, however, in the direction the corpse pointed out to him. He could not have told himself how long he had been going, when the dead man behind suddenly squeezed him and said, "There." Teig looked from him, and he saw a little low wall that was so broken down in places it was no wall at all. It was in a great wide field, in from the road, and only for 3 or 4 great stones at the corners that were more like rocks than stones. There was nothing to show that there was either graveyard or burying ground there. "Is this Imlog fada? Shall I bury you here?" said Teig. "Yes," said the voice. "But I see no grave or gravestone, only this pile of stones," said Teig. The corpse did not answer, but stretched out its long fleshless hand to show Teig the direction in which he was to go. Teig went on accordingly, but he was greatly terrified, for he remembered what had happened to him at the last place. He went on, with his heart in his mouth, as he said himself afterwards, but when he came to within 15 or 20 yards of the little low square wall, there broke out a flash of lightning, bright yellow and red, with blue streaks in it, and went round the wall in one course, and it swept by as fast as the swallow in the clouds, and the longer Teig remained looking at it, the faster it went, till at last it became like a bright ring of flame round the old graveyard, which no one could pass without being burnt by it. Teig never saw, from the time he was born, and never saw afterwards, so wonderful or so splendid a sight as that was. Round went the flame, white and yellow and blue sparks leaping out from it as it went, and although at first it had been no more than a thin narrow line, it increased slowly until it was at last a great broad band, and it was continually getting broader and higher, and throwing out more brilliant sparks, till there was never a colour on the ridge of the earth that was not to be seen in that fire, and lightning never shone and flame never flamed that was so shining and so bright as that. Teig was amazed. He was half dead with fatigue, and he had no courage left to approach the wall. There fell a mist over his eyes, and there came a soorawn in his head, and he was obliged to sit down upon a great stone to recover himself. He could see nothing but the light, and could hear nothing but the whir of it as it shot round the paddock faster than a flash of lightning. As he sat there on the stone, the voice whispered once more in his ear, "Kill Breda," and the dead man squeezed him so tightly that he cried out. He rose again, sick, tired, and trembling, and went forwards as he was directed. The wind was cold, and the road was bad, and the load on his back was heavy, and the night was dark, and he himself was nearly worn out, and if he had had very much further to go, he must have fallen dead under his burden. At last the corpse stretched out his hand, and said to him, "Bury me there." "This is the last burying place," said Teig in his own mind, "and the little grey man said I'd be allowed to bury him in some of them, so it must be this. It can't be but they'll let him in here." The first faint streak of the ring of day was appearing in the east, and the clouds were beginning to catch fire, but it was darker than ever, for the moon was set, and there were no stars. Make haste," said the corpse, and Teig hurried forward as well as he could to the graveyard, which was a little place on a bare hill with only a few graves in it. He walked boldly in through the open gate, and nothing touched him, nor did he either hear or see anything. He came to the middle of the ground, and then he stood up and looked round him for a spade or shovel to make a grave. As he was turning round and searching, he suddenly perceived what startled him greatly, a newly dug grave right before him. He moved over to it and looked down, and there at the bottom he saw a black coffin. He clambered down into the hole and lifted the lid, and found that, as he thought it would be, the coffin was empty. He had hardly mounted up out of the hole, and was standing on the brink, when the corpse, which had clung to him for more than 8 hours, suddenly relaxed its hold of his neck, and loosened its shins from round his hips, and sank down with a plop into the open coffin. Teig fell down onto his 2 knees at the brink of the grave, and gave thanks to God. He made no delay then, but pressed down the coffin lid in its place, and threw in the clay over it with his 2 hands, and when the grave was filled up, he stamped and leaped on it with his feet until it was firm and hard, and then he left the place. The sun was fast rising as he finished his work, and the first thing he did was to return to the road, and look out for a house to rest himself in. He found an inn at last, and lay down upon a bed there, and slept till night. Then he rose up and ate a little, and fell asleep again till morning. When he awoke in the morning, he hired a horse and rode home. He was more than 26 miles from home where he was, and he had come all that way with the dead body on his back in one night. All the people at his own home thought that he must have left the country, and they rejoiced greatly when they saw him come back. Every one began asking him where he had been, but he would not tell anyone except his father. He was a changed man from that day. He never drank too much, he never lost his money over cards, and especially he would not take the world and be out late by himself of a dark night. He was not a fortnight home until he married Mary, the girl he had been in love with, and it's at their wedding the sport was, and it's he was the happy man from that day forward, and it's all I wish that we may be as happy as he was. End section 4. Section 5 of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry by William Butler Yeats. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Paddy Corcoran's wife, William Carleton. Paddy Corcoran's wife was for several years afflicted with a kind of complaint which nobody could properly understand. She was sick, and she was not sick. She was well, and she was not well. She was as ladies wish to be who love their lords, and she was not as such ladies wish to be. In fact, nobody could tell what the matter with her was. She had a gnawing at the heart which came heavily upon her husband, for, with the help of God,
A keener appetite than the same gnawing amounted to could not be met with of a summer's day. The poor woman was delicate beyond belief, and had no appetite at all. So she hadn't, barring a little relish for a mutton chop, or a steak, or a bit of mate anyway. For sure, God help her, she hadn't the least inclination for the dreary pratie, or the dollop of sour buttermilk along with it, especially as she was so poorly, and indeed, for a woman in her condition, for, sick as she was, poor Paddy always was made to believe her in that condition, but God's will be done, she didn't care. A pratie and a grain o' salt was a welcome to her, glory be to his name, as the best roast and boiled that ever was dressed, and why not? There was one comfort, she wouldn't be long with him, long troubling him. It mattered little what she got, but sure she knew herself that from the gnawing at her heart she could never do good without that little bit o' mate now and then, and sure if her own husband begrudged it to her, who else had she a better right to expect it from? Well, as we have said, she lay a bedridden invalid for long enough, trying doctors and quacks of all sorts, sexes, and sizes, and all without a farthing's benefit, until, at the long run, poor Paddy was nearly brought to the last pass in striving to keep her in the bit o' mate. The 7th year was now on the point of closing, when, one harvest day, as she lay bemoaning her hard condition, on her bed beyond the kitchen fire, a little weeshy woman, dressed in a neat red cloak, comes in, and setting down by the hearth, says, "Well, Kitty Corcoran, you've had a long layer of it there on the broad o' your back for 7 years, and you're just as far from being cured as ever." "Mavrone, aye," said the other, "in troth that's what I was this minute thinking of, and a sorrowful thought it's to me." "It's your own fault then," says the little woman, "and indeed, for that matter, it's your fault that ever you were there at all." "Arrah, how is that?" asked Kitty. "Sure I wouldn't be here if I could help it. Do you think it's a comfort or a pleasure to me to be sick and bedridden?" "No," said the other, "I do not, but I'll tell you the truth. For the last 7 years you have been annoying us. I am one of the good people, and as I have a regard for you, I've come to let you know the reason why you've been sick so long as you are. For all the time you've been ill, if you'll take the trouble to remember, your children threwn out your dirty water after dusk and before sunrise, at the very time we're passing your door, which we pass twice a day. Now, if you avoid this, if you throw it out in a different place, and at a different time, the complaint you have will lave you, so will the gnawing at the heart, and you'll be as well as ever you were. If you don't follow this advice, why, remain as you are, and all the art o' man can't cure you." She then bade her good-bye, and disappeared. Kitty, who was glad to be cured on such easy terms, immediately complied with the injunction of the fairy, and the consequence was, that the next day she found herself in as good a health as ever she enjoyed during her life. Cusheen Loo, translated from the Irish by J. Callanan. This song is supposed to have been sung by a young bride who was forcibly detained in one of those forts which are so common in Ireland, and to which the good people are very fond of resorting. Under pretence of hushing her child to rest, she retired to the outside margin of the fort, and addressed the burthen of her song to a young woman whom she saw at a short distance, and whom she requested to inform her husband of her condition, and to desire him to bring the steel knife to dissolve the enchantment. Sleep, my child, for the rustling trees, stirred by the breath of summer breeze, and fairy songs of sweetest note around us gently float. Sleep, for the weeping flowers have shed their fragrant tears upon thy head. The voice of love hath soothed thy rest, and thy pillow is a mother's breast. Sleep, my child. Weary hath passed the time forlorn, since to your mansion I was born, though bright the feast of its airy halls, and the voice of mirth resounds from its walls. Sleep, my child. Full many a maid and blooming bride within that splendid dome abide, and many a hoar and shrivelled sage, and many a matron bowed with age. Sleep, my child. O thou who hearest this song of fear, to the mourner's home these tidings bear. Bid him bring the knife of the magic blade, at whose lightning flash the charm will fade. Sleep, my child. Haste, for tomorrow's sun will see the hateful spell renewed for me. Nor can I from that home depart, till life shall leave my withering heart. Sleep, my child. Sleep, my child, for the rustling trees, stirred by the breath of summer breeze, and fairy songs of sweetest note around us gently float. The White Trout, a Legend of Cong, by S. Lover. There was once upon a time, long ago, a beautiful lady that lived in a castle upon the lake beyond, and they say she was promised to a king's son, and they were to be married, when all of a sudden he was murthered, the crathur, Lord help us, and thrown into the lake above, and so, of course, he couldn't keep his promise to the fair lady, and more's the pity. Well, the story goes that she went out of her mind, because of losing the king's son, for she was tender-hearted, God help her, like the rest of us, and pined away after him until at last no one about seen her, good or bad, and the story went that the fairies took her away. Well, sir, in course o' time, the White Throut, God bless it, was seen in the stream beyond, and sure the people didn't know what to think of the crathur, seeing as how a white throut was never heard of before nor since, and years upon years the throut was there, just where you seen it this blessed minute, longer nor I can tell, aye troth, and beyond the memory of the oldest in the village. At last the people began to think it must be a fairy, for what else could it be? And no hurt or harm was ever put on the White Throut until some wicked sinners of soldiers came to these parts, and laughed at all the people, and jibed and jeered them for thinking o' the likes, and one of them in particular, bad luck to him, God forgive me for saying it, swore he'd catch the throut and eat it for his dinner, the blackguard. Well, what do you think of the villainy of the soldier? Sure enough he caught the throut, and away wid him home, and puts it in the frying pan, and into it he pitches the purty little thing. The throut squealed all as one as a Christian cratur, and, my dear, you'd think the soldier had split his sides laughing, for he was a hardened villain, and when he thought one side was done, he turns it over to fry the other, and what would you think but the devil a taste of a burn was on it at all, and sure the soldier thought it was a quare throut that could not be broiled. But, says he, I'll give it another turn by and by, little thinking what was in store for him, the haythen. Well, when he thought that side was done, he turns it again, and lo and behold you, the devil of a taste more done that side was nor the other. Bad luck to me, says the soldier, but that bates the world, says he. But I'll try you again, my darlint, says he, as cunning as you think yourself. And so with that he turns it over and over, but not a sign of the fire was on the purty throut. Well, says the desperate villain, for sure, sir, only he was a desperate villain entirely, he might know he was doing a wrong thing, seeing as all his endeavours were no good. Well, says he, my jolly little throut, maybe you're fried enough, though you don't seem to be over well dressed, but you may be better than you look, like a singed cat and a titbit after all, says he, and with that he ups with his knife and fork to taste a piece of the throut. But, my jewel, the minute he puts his knife into the fish, there was a murtherin' screech, and you'd think the life would lave you if you heard it, and away jumps the throut out of the frying pan and into the middle of the floor, and in the spot where it fell, up rose a lovely lady, the beautifullest cratur that I's ever seen, dressed in white, and a band of gold in her hair, and a stream of blood running down her arm. "Look where you cut me, you villain," says she, and she held out her arm to him, and, my dear, he thought the sight'd lave his eyes. "Couldn't you lave me cool and comfortable in the river where you snared me, and not disturb me in my duty?" says she. Well, he thrembled like a dog in a wet sack, and at last he stammered out something, and begged for his life, and axed her ladyship's pardon, and said he didn't know she was on duty, or he was too good a soldier not to know better nor to meddle with her. "I was on duty then," says the lady. "I was watching for my true love that is coming to water to me," says she, "and if he comes while I'm away, and that I miss of him, I'll turn you into a pinkeen and hunt you up and down for evermore, while the grass grows or water runs." Well, the soldier thought the life had lave him at the thoughts of his being turned into a pinkeen, and begged for mercy, and with that, says the lady, "Renounce your evil course," says she, "you villain, or you'll repent it too late. Be a good man for the future, and go to your duty regular, and now," says she, "take me back and put me into the river again, where you found me." "Oh, my lady," says the soldier, "how could I have the heart to drown a beautiful lady like you?" But before he could say another word, the lady was vanished, and there he saw the little throut on the ground, Well, he put it in a clean plate, and away he runs for the bare life, for fear her lover would come while she was away, and he run, even till he came to the cave again, and threw the throut into the river. The minute he did it, the water was as red as blood for a little while, by raison of the cut, I suppose, until the sthrame washed the stain away, and to this day there's a little red mark on the trout's side where it was cut. Well, sir, from that day out the soldier was an altered man, and reformed his ways, and went to his duty regular, and fasted 3 times a week, though it was never fish he took on fastin' days, for after the fright he got, fish should never rest in his stomach, save in your presence. But anyhow, he was an altered man, as I said before, and in course o' time he left the army, and turned hermit at last, and they say he used to pray evermore for the soul of the white trout. These trout stories are common all over Ireland. Many holy wells are haunted by such blessed trout. There is a trout in a well on the border of Lugill, Sligo, that some paganish person put once on the gridiron. It carries the marks to this day. Long ago the saint who sanctified the well put that trout there. Nowadays it is only visible to the pious who have done due penance. End section 5. Section 6 of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry by William Butler Yeats. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fairy Thorn, an Ulster Ballad, Sir Samuel Ferguson. Get up, our Anna dear, from the weary spinning wheel, for your father's on the hill, and your mother's asleep. Come up above the crags, and we'll dance a Highland reel around the fairy thorn on the steep. At Anna Grace's door 'twas thus the maidens cried, 3 merry maidens fair in kirtles of the green, and Anna laid the rock and the weary wheel aside, the fairest of the 4, I ween. There glancing through the glimmer of the quiet eve, away in milky wavings of neck and ankle bare, the heavy sliding stream in its sleepy song they leave, and the crags in the ghostly air. And linking hand in hand, and singing as they go, the maids along the hillside have ta'en their fearless way, till they come to where the rowan trees in lonely beauty grow, beside the fairy hawthorn grey. The hawthorn stands between the ashes tall and slim, like matron with her twin granddaughters at her knee. The rowan berries cluster o'er her low head grey and dim, in ruddy kisses sweet to see. The merry maidens 4 have ranged them in a row, between each lovely couple a stately rowan stem, and away in mazes wavy like skimming birds they go, oh never carolled bird like them. But solemn is the silence of the silvery haze, that drinks away their voices in echoless repose, and dreamily the evening has stilled the haunted braes, and dreamier the gloaming grows. And sinking one by one, like lark notes from the sky, when the falcon's shadow saileth across the open shaw, are hushed the maidens' voices, as cowering down they lie, in the flutter of their sudden awe. For, from the air above, and the grassy ground beneath, and from the mountain ashes and the old whitethorn between, a power of faint enchantment doth through their beings breathe, and they sink down together on the green. They sink together silent, and stealing side by side, they fling their lovely arms o'er their drooping necks so fair, they vainly strive again their naked arms to hide, for their shrinking necks again are bare. Thus clasped and prostrate all, with their heads together bowed, soft o'er their bosoms beating, the only human sound, they hear the silky footsteps of the silent fairy crowd, like a river in the air gliding round. No scream can any raise, no prayer can any say, but wild, wild the terror of the speechless 3, for they feel fair Anna Grace drawn silently away, by whom they dare not look to see. They feel their tresses twine with her parting locks of gold, and the curls elastic falling as her head withdraws. They feel her sliding arms from their tranced arms unfold, but they may not look to see the cause. For heavy on their senses the faint enchantment lies, through all that night of anguish and perilous amaze, and neither fear nor wonder can ope their quivering eyes, or their limbs from the cold ground raise. Till out of night the earth has rolled her dewy side, with every haunted mountain and streaming vale below, when as the mist dissolves in the yellow morning tide, the maiden's trance dissolveth so. Then fly the ghastly three as swiftly as they may, and tell their tale of sorrow to anxious friends in vain. They pined away and died within the year and day, and ne'er was Anna Grace seen again. The Legend of Knockgrafton, T. Crofton Croker. There was once a poor man who lived in the fertile glen of Arrow, at the foot of the gloomy Galtee mountains, and he had a great hump on his back. He looked just as if his body had been rolled up and placed upon his shoulders, and his head was pressed down with the weight, so much that his chin, when he was setting, used to rest upon his knees for support. The country people were rather shy of meeting him in any lonesome place, for though, poor creature, he was as harmless and as inoffensive as a newborn infant, yet his deformity was so great that he scarcely appeared to be a human creature, and some ill-minded persons had set strange stories about him afloat. He was said to have a great knowledge of herbs and charms, but certain it was that he had a mighty skilful hand in plaiting straws and rushes into hats and baskets, which was the way he made his livelihood. Lusmore, for that was the nickname put upon him by reason of his always wearing a sprig of the fairy cap, or Lismore, the foxglove, in his little straw hat, would ever get a higher penny for his plaited work than any one else, and perhaps that was the reason why someone, out of envy, had circulated the strange stories about him. Be that as it may, it happened that he was returning one evening from the pretty town of Cahir towards Capac, and as little Lusmore walked very slowly, on account of the great hump upon his back, it was quite dark when he came to the old moat of Knockgrafton, which stood on the right-hand side of his road. Tired and weary was he, and no ways comfortable in his own mind at thinking how much further he had to travel, and that he should be walking all the night. So he sat down under the moat to rest himself, and began looking mournfully enough upon the moon, which, rising in clouded majesty at length, apparent queen, unveiled her peerless light, and o'er the dark her silver mantle threw. Presently there rose a wild strain of unearthly melody upon the ear of little Lusmore. He listened, and he thought that he had never heard such ravishing music before. It was like the sound of many voices, each mingling and blending with the other so strangely that they seemed to be one, though all singing different strains, and the words of the song were these: Da lune da mort, da lune da mort, da lune da mort, when there would be a moment's pause, and then the round of melody went on again. Lusmore listened attentively, scarcely drawing his breath lest he might lose the slightest note. He now plainly perceived that the singing was within the moat, and though at first it had charmed him so much, he began to get tired of hearing the same round sung over and over so often without any change. So, availing himself of the pause when Da Lune da Mort had been sung 3 times, he took up the tune, and raised it with the words August da Dardine, and then went on singing with the voices inside of the moat, Da Lune da Mort finishing the melody when the pause came again, with August da Dardine. The fairies within Knockgrafton, for the song was a fairy melody, when they heard this addition to the tune, were so much delighted that, with instant resolve, it was determined to bring the mortal among them, whose musical skill so far exceeded theirs. And little Lusmore was conveyed into their company with the eddying speed of a whirlwind. Glorious to behold was the sight that burst upon him as he came down through the moat, twirling round and round with the lightness of a straw, to the sweetest music that kept time to his motion. The greatest honour was then paid him, for he was put above all the musicians, and he had servants tending upon him, and everything to his heart's content, and a hearty welcome to all, and in short, he was made as much of as if he had been the first man in the land. Presently Lusmore saw a great consultation going forward amongst the fairies, and notwithstanding all their civility, he felt very much frightened, until one stepping out from the rest came up to him and said, Lusmore, Lusmore, doubt not nor deplore, for the hump which you bore on your back is no more. Look down on the floor, and view it, Lusmore. When these words were said, poor little Lusmore felt himself so light and so happy that he thought he could have bounded at one jump over the moon, like the cow in the history of the Cat and the Fiddle, and he saw, with inexpressible pleasure, his hump tumbled down upon the ground from his shoulders. He then tried to lift up his head, and he did so with becoming caution, fearing that he might knock it against the ceiling of the grand hall, where he was. He looked round and round again with the greatest wonder and delight upon everything, which appeared more and more beautiful, and overpowered at beholding such a resplendent scene. His head grew dizzy, and his eyesight became dim. At last he fell into a sound sleep, and when he awoke he found that it was broad daylight, the sun shining brightly, and the birds singing sweetly, and he was lying just at the foot of the moat of Knockgrafton, with the cows and sheep grazing peaceably round about him. The first thing Lusmore did, after saying his prayers, was to put his hand behind to feel for his hump, but no sign of one was there on his back, and he looked at himself with great pride, for he had now become a well-shaped, dapper little fellow, and more than that, found himself in a full suit of new clothes, which he concluded the fairies had made for him. Towards Capa he went, stepping out as lightly, and springing at every step as if he had been all his life a dancing-master. Not a creature who met Lusmore knew him without his hump, and he had a great work to persuade every one that he was the same man. In truth he was not, so far as the outward appearance went. Of course it was not long before the story of Lusmore's hump got about, and a great wonder was made of it. Through the country, for miles round, it was the talk of every one, high and low. One morning, as Lusmore was sitting contented enough at his cabin door, up came an old woman to him, and asked if he could direct her to Capna. "I need give you no directions, my good woman," said Lusmore, "for this is Capna, and whom may you want here?" "I have come," said the woman, "out of D.C.'s country, in the county of Waterford, looking after one Lusmore, who, I have heard tell, had his hump taken off by the fairies, for there is a son of a gossip of mine who has got a hump on him that will be his death, and maybe, if he could use the same charm as Lusmore, the hump may be taken off him. And now I have told you the reason of my coming so far. 'Tis to find out about this charm, if I can." Lusmore, who was ever a good-natured little fellow, told the woman all the particulars, how he had raised the tune for the fairies at Knockgrafton, how his hump had been removed from his shoulders, and how he had got a new suit of clothes into the bargain. The woman thanked him very much, and then went away quite happy and easy in her own mind. When she came back to her gossip's house in the county of Waterford, she told her everything Lusmore had said, and they put the little hump-backed man, who was a peevish and cunning creature from his birth, upon a car, and took him all the way across the country. It was a long journey, but they did not care for that, so the hump was taken from off him, and they brought him just at nightfall, and left him under the old moat of Knockgrafton. Jack Madden, for that was the humpy man's name, had not been sitting there long when he heard the tune going on within the moat much sweeter than before, for the fairies were singing it the way Lusmore had settled their music for them, and the song was going on, Da lune da mort, da lune da mort, da lune da mort, Angus da Dardine, without ever stopping. Jack Madden, who was in a great hurry to get quit of his hump, never thought of waiting until the fairies had done, or watching for a fit opportunity to raise the tune higher again than Lusmore had. So, having heard them sing it over 7 times without stopping, out he bawls, never minding the time or the humour of the tune, or how he could bring his words in properly, Angus Dardine, Angus Dahina, thinking that if one day were good, 2 were better, and if Lusmore had one new suit of clothes given him, he should have 2. No sooner had the words passed his lips than he was taken up and whisked into the moat with prodigious force, and the fairies came crowding round about him with great anger, screeching and screaming and roaring out, "Who spoiled our tune? Who spoiled our tune?" And one stepped up to him above all the rest, and said, "Jack Madden, Jack Madden, your words came so bad in the tune we felt glad in, the castle you're had in, that your life we may sadden, here's 2 humps for Jack Madden." And 20 of the strongest fairies brought out Lusmore's hump, and put it down upon poor Jack's back, over his own, where it became fixed as firmly as if it was nailed on, with 12-penny nails, by the best carpenter that ever drove one. Out of their castle they kicked him, and in the morning, when Jack Madden's mother and her gossip came to look after their little man, they found him half dead, lying at the foot of the moat, with the other hump upon his back. Well, to be sure, how they did look at each other! But they were afraid to say anything, lest a hump might be put upon their own shoulders. Home they brought the unlucky Jack Madden with them, as downcast in their hearts and their looks as ever two gossips were. And what through the weight of his other hump and the long journey, he died soon after, leaving, they say, his heavy curse to any one who would go listen to fairy tunes again. A Donegal Fairy, Letitia McClintock. Ay, it's a bad thing to displeasure the gentry, sure enough. They can be unfriendly if they're angered, and they can be the very best o' good neighbours if they're treated kindly. My mother's sister was her lone in the house one day, wi' a big pot o' water boiling on the fire, and one o' the wee folk fell down the chimney and slipped with his leg in the hot water. He let a terrible squeal out o' him, and in a minute the house was full o' wee creatures pulling him out o' the pot and carrying him across the floor. "Did she scald you?" my aunt heard them saying to him. "Na, na, it was mysel' scalded my own self," quoth the wee fellow. A weel," says they. "If it was your own self scalded yoursel, we'll say nothing, but if she had scalded you, we'd ha' made her pay." Section 6. Section 7 of Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry by William Butler Yeats. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Trooping Fairies, Changelings. Sometimes the fairies fancy mortals, and carry them away into their own country, leaving instead some sickly fairy child, or a log of wood so bewitched that it seems to be a mortal pining away, and dying, and being buried. Most commonly they steal children. If you overlook a child, that is, look on it with envy, the fairies have it in their power. Many things can be done to find out in a child a changeling, but there is one infallible thing. Lay it on the fire with this formula: "Burn, burn, burn, if of the devil, burn, but if God and the saints, be safe from harm." Given by Lady Wilde. Then if it be a changeling, it will rush up the chimney with a cry, for according to Giraldus Cambresis, fire is the greatest of enemies to every sort of phantom, insomuch that those who have seen apparitions fall into a swoon as soon as they are sensible of the brightness of fire. Sometimes the creature is got rid of in a more gentle way. It is on record that once when a mother was leaning over a wizened changeling, the latch lifted and a fairy came in, carrying home again the wholesome stolen baby. It was the others, she said, who stole it. As for her, she wanted her own child. Those who carried away are happy, according to some accounts, having plenty of good living and music and mirth. Others say, however, that they are continually longing for their earthly friends. Lady Wilde gives a gloomy tradition that there are two kinds of fairies, one kind merry and gentle, the other evil, and sacrificing every year a life to Satan, for which purpose they steal mortals. No other Irish writer gives this tradition. If such fairies there be, they must be among the solitary spirits, Pookas, Feardarags, and the like. The Brewery of Eggshells, T. Crofton Croker. Mrs. Sullivan fancied that her youngest child had been exchanged by fairies' theft, and certainly appearances warranted such a conclusion, for in one night her healthy blue-eyed boy had become shrivelled up into almost nothing, and never ceased squalling and crying. This naturally made poor Mrs. Sullivan very unhappy, and all of the neighbours, by way of comforting her, said that her own child was, beyond any kind of doubt, with the good people, and that one of themselves was put in his place. Mrs. Sullivan, of course, could not disbelieve what everyone told her, but she did not wish to hurt the thing, for although its face was so withered, and its body wasted away to a mere skeleton, it had still a strong resemblance to her own boy. She, therefore, could not find it in her heart to roast it alive on the griddle, or to burn its nose off with the red-hot tongs, or to throw it out in the snow on the roadside. Notwithstanding these, and several like proceedings, were strongly recommended to her for the recovery of her own child. One day who should Mrs. Sullivan meet but a cunning woman, well known about the country by the name of Ellen Lee, or Grey Ellen. She had the gift, however she got it, of telling where the dead were, and what was good for the rest of their souls, and could charm away warts and wens, and do a great many wonderful things of the same nature. "You're in grief this morning, Mrs. Sullivan," were the first words Ellen Lee to her. "You may say that, Ellen," said Mrs. Sullivan,
and good cause I have to be in grief, for there was my own fine child whipped from me out of his cradle without so much as a by your leave or ask your pardon, and an ugly dawny bit of shrivelled up fairy put in his place. No wonder then you see me in grief, Ellen." "Small blame to you, Mrs. Sullivan," said Ellen Leigh. "But are you sure 'tis a fairy?" "Sure," echoed Mrs. Sullivan. "Sure enough I am to my sorrow, and can I doubt my own two eyes? Every mother's soul must feel for me." "Will you take an old woman's advice?" said Ellen Leigh, fixing her wild and mysterious gaze upon the unhappy mother, and after a pause she added, "But maybe you'll call it foolish." "Can you get me back my child, my own child, Ellen?" said Mrs. Sullivan with great energy. "If you do as I bid you," returned Ellen Leigh, "you'll know." Mrs. Sullivan was silent in expectation, and Ellen continued, "Put down the big pot full of water on the fire, and make it boil like mad. Then get a dozen new leg eggs, break them, and keep the shells, but throw away the rest. When that is done, put the shells in the pot of boiling water, and you will soon know whether it is your own boy or a fairy. If you find that it is a fairy in the cradle, take the red-hot poker and cram it down his ugly throat, and you will not have much trouble with him after that, I promise you." Home went Mrs. Sullivan, and did as Ellen Leigh desired. She put the pot on the fire, and plenty of turf under it, and set the water boiling at such a rate that if ever water was red hot, it surely was. The child was lying, for a wonder, quite easy and quiet in the cradle, every now and then cocking his eye, that would twinkle as keen as a star in a frosty night, over at the giant fire and the big pot upon it, and he looked on with great attention at Mrs. Sullivan breaking the eggs and putting down the eggshells to boil. At last he asked, with the voice of a very old man, "What are you doing, mammy?" Mrs. Sullivan's heart, as she said herself, was up in her mouth ready to choke her at hearing the child speak, but she contrived to put the poker in the fire, and to answer, without making any wonder at the words, "I'm brewing, avick, my son." "What are you brewing, mammy?" said the little imp, whose supernatural gift of speech now proved beyond question that he was a fairy substitute. "I wish the poker was red," thought Mrs. Sullivan, but it was a large one, and took a long time heating, so she determined to keep him in talk until the poker was in a proper state to thrust down his throat, and therefore repeated the question. "Is what I'm brewing, avick," said she, "you want to know?" "Yes, mammy. What are you brewing?" returned the fairy. "Eggshells, avick," said Mrs. Sullivan. "Oh!" shrieked the imp, starting up in the cradle and clapping his hands together. "I'm 1500 years in the world, and I never saw a brewery of eggshells before." The poker was by this time quite red, and Mrs. Sullivan, seizing it, ran furiously toward the cradle, but somehow or other her foot slipped, and she fell flat on the floor, and the poker flew out of her hand to the other end of the house. However, she got up without much loss of time and went to the cradle, intending to pitch the wicked thing that was in it into the pot of boiling water, when there she saw her own child in a sweet sleep. One of his soft round arms rested upon the pillows. His features were as placid as if their repose had never been disturbed, save the rosy mouth, which moved with a gentle and regular breathing. The Fairy Nurse, by Edward Walsh. Sweet babe, a golden cradle holds thee, and soft the snow-white fleece enfolds thee. In airy bower I'll watch thy sleeping, where branchy trees to the breeze are sweeping. Shuheen sho lulu lo, when mothers languish broken-hearted, when young wives are from husbands parted. Ah, little think the keeners lonely, they weep some time-worn fairy only. Shuheen sho lulu lo. Within our magic halls of brightness trips many a foot of snowy whiteness. Stolen maidens, queens of fairy, and kings and chiefs, a slew shieri. Shuheen sho lulo lo. Rest thee, babe, I love thee dearly, and as thy mortal mother nearly. Ours is the swiftest steed and proudest, that moves where the tramp of the host is loudest. Shuheen sho lo lo lu. Rest thee, babe, for soon thy slumbers shall flee at the magic Colchi's numbers. In airy bower I'll watch thy sleeping, where branchy trees to the breeze are sweeping. Shuheen sho lu lo lo. End section 7.